Let's talk about human intelligence in the Middle East and why it's important. And we really can't talk about that without reviewing the events around October 7th. So what is the cost of a single intelligence failure? In the Middle East today, the scorecard is pretty shockingly clear. 50 Americans were killed. I just have to throw this out as a former US intelligence official. If an American is killed in a terrorist attack, we have the writ, us and the FBI, it's my former organization, CIA and the FBI, to investigate. 1,300 Israelis that day, maybe 800-900 civilians, the rest Israeli military personnel. Then I think another up to 1,000 IDF have been killed in Gaza. And of course, over 70,000 Palestinians dead, many of them civilians. So a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, epic in scope. I think historians, many people here, will study the cost of this intelligence failure for generations. You know, similar to 9/11, which cost the U.S. Certainly countless lives, trillions of dollars in a 2-decade war in South Asia, the reverberations in the Middle East over October 7th continue to be profound, and the region is no different. Is no doubt a different place. But let's get back to kind of the notion of intelligence. Intelligence is a nation's first line of defense for any country. That was the mantra at CIA that we certainly prided ourselves on. You know, we were the ones standing on the ramparts. I love talking about that, especially the younger officers. You know, we're sending officers out into the field with linguistic, with cultural expertise to far-off lands to report back to Washington. And the critical goal of a field intelligence officer is to recruit sources, and I'll call them agents here, that provide indicators and warning. Because what policymakers hate, they hate to be surprised. You know, intelligence doesn't make policy, it informs correct decision making. And especially when I served overseas, I would go to an ambassador or perhaps a senior military official, and I said, look, we're going to do a lot of things here, but what I'm going to promise you, I'm going to do the best of my abilities, is for you never to be surprised. And that really was my writ. So with that above-mentioned context, think about the region's intelligence services. And frankly, I'll add Western intelligence as well, on October 7th and the days after. You know, from the American Director of Intelligence at the time, Avril Haines, to CIA Director Bill Burns. Can you imagine the conversations they had with President Biden? How about Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Service, Ronen Bar, the chief there, going to Prime Minister Netanyahu after October 7th, or even the chief of Jordanian General Intelligence with King Abdullah, because the policymakers all are going to ask, what happened? You know, what did we miss? How did we miss this? And I throw one other notion in here that I think it's important, that I've kind of tried to live by in my career, and I think some of my colleagues of other services as well, is the idea of humility. It's the notion that we make mistakes sometimes, and we have to own that. And that's, you know, you have to own it, you have to find out what happened and how you fix it. I'm not privy to the classified world anymore. I certainly have contacts in Israel, but the after-action report over October 7th is going to be quite brutal. From kind of an Israeli over-reliance on technology, such as border fences and sensors, for example, to even on the American side, the U.S. ceding the Hamas target to the Israelis. In 1996, I sat on an operational desk in CIA's headquarters, the Counterterrorism Center that focused on Hamas. Didn't exist after 9/11. We shifted to Al-Qaeda. So I think it is incumbent on the region's intelligence services, Israel, the Arab states, but also the U.S., frankly, perhaps even the UK, to take some ownership over how this happened under our watch. I'll note that then Shin Bet Director Ronen Bar put out a remarkable statement to his workforce after October 7th. He took responsibility. 10 Shin Bet operators were killed responding that day. So it felt personal to him as well, and he then later resigned. I'll note that the Israeli political establishment has not done the same. That's something that, well, again, perhaps one day we will see a commission of inquiry. But back to 10/7, it's something that I note, and I think it's really powerful statements, the idea of the power of one. What does that mean in intelligence? A single source, in my view, can change the course of history. It's a dramatic statement, perhaps, and I lecture on national security quite often. But the power of one means that a single, properly placed, vetted source can provide information of such immense value on what? A weapons transfer, maybe in train, maybe a country may invade, or perhaps a terrorist group is poised to attack. Unlike for example, the construction of a border fence or the intercept of a single cell phone conversation, by obtaining a phone number, for example, the cultivation of a source, which may take months, weeks, even years, it's time consuming, but that juice is worth the squeeze. As I really believe, and I'm biased, of course, as a former case officer, HUMINT is a unique discipline in the intelligence world, different than all other disciplines. A source can provide context on the plans and intentions, knit together the data collected from intercepts or imagery. A source can be debriefed. It's kind of a living, breathing organism. It's not a single dynamic a single static intercept of a telephone call. It's something that can kind of live and breathe and can report details of meetings, for example, have sidebar conversations. They can observe and collect classified documents. In my view, a source is the tip of the spear, an asset, an agent, not what I did, not perhaps what John or some others in the room did. We were case officers. We handled sources. The sources are the real heroes. And so again, where were the nation's intelligence services on Hamas? Surely Hamas, certainly practiced sound operational security. We have heard that, for example, they developed a system of communications they only used in the tunnel network. That was to evade Israeli signals intelligence collection. But Hamas was not the East German Stasi. Shin Bet, the internal service, should have been better. And we used to say in CIA, very common in the intelligence world, the enemy gets a vote, and they certainly did that day. So was there a pool of, for example, potential agent candidates for the region's intelligence services to target? Well, this wasn't a small-scale attack on October 7th. If you look at 9/11, that was a cell of al-Qaeda, and we missed it at CIA, no doubt about that, although there were certainly some signs. But this was a 3,000-man Hamas terrorist army, I would say, that not for days, weeks, months, or years planned this operation. And did they do it alone? No. As documents that have been recovered in Gaza and the tunnels showed, the Iranians knew about it. So how did we all miss this? Pretty extraordinary. And you think about that, and I still kind of wonder to this day. Again, Shin Bet, Jordanian GID, even the CIA, British intelligence. How could we not recruit a single source who would have warned us about that? And that is what I call the power of one. Again, a source that could have prevented these cataclysmic events. And as a former case officer, it's something that I still am mystified at today. Now, there will be, as I said, an inquiry. Shin Bet, the internal Israeli service, is probably the one most culpable, and I think an over-reliance on technology is going to be found, and perhaps some humility is in order. But Israeli intelligence and the kind of the nature of HUMINT we're talking about did kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they're certainly on the rebound. So this story didn't end on October 7th, because then the Israelis demonstrated the capabilities that many of us really thought that they had, and they prosecuted the war in other arenas, for example. And we'll focus a little bit on Mossad, the external service. And there's many celebrated operations that you certainly have heard in press. Again, I don't have access to Israeli intelligence files, but all of these that I'll mention certainly have a human component into it. And we think about the joke I just had with Shashank, the find, fix, and finish operations. We were calling it an airstrike. We probably had, the two of us, had a human source on the ground calling that in. The pager operation, again, a multi-year effort involving supply chain operations. This decapitation operation in September 2024 took out anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 Hezbollah rank and file. Extraordinary. The Mossad created over years front companies, manufactured the pager devices. Is there a human component there? Of course it is. These are human beings doing this. These are Mossad officers and agents they recruited. Perhaps not a traditional foreign intelligence recruitment operation, but nonetheless done by humans. I would say that's probably the most celebrated decapitation strike in intelligence history. There are historians here in this room, and I hope you all understand, at least from my perspective, and I think, John, we talked about it before, really remarkable achievement. It also did a couple things that caused a nightmare for Hezbollah's counterintelligence apparatus. They knew that they had been penetrated. Think about other operations, the Israeli assassination operations against Iranian nuclear scientists. The Israeli journalist Yossi Melman just put out a book 2 days ago. You can find it on Kindle, on Amazon Kindle. It's about 60 pages, and it talks about how the Israelis very patiently over time recruited agents. We're talking about Iran with a multitude of ethnic groups. Mossad was able to recruit ethnic Iranians, and they did so out of country, and then sent them back in. And if you saw in the news, you saw some videos of it said Mossad, it wasn't officers, Mossad with night vision goggles. They were actually building a drone to shoot at Iranian air defense sites, and also for the nuclear targets, the assassinations. That wasn't a Mossad officer. That was a principal agent network recruited by the Israelis. Pretty remarkable. The strike in Beirut that killed Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah. Again, find, fix, and finish operations involve HUMINT. That's, humans can actually be the key piece, because they have established what pattern of life of a target. The strike in Tehran in July 2024 against Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, and one other note, the strike on Fuad Shukr, a Hezbollah member, in July 2024. where the Israelis, and they talked about it publicly, used human sources to put Shukr on the X. And that for us in CIA meant something. Fouad Shukr was one of the key masterminds of the bombing in 1983 at the US Embassy in Beirut. So certainly no tears were shed in the US circles. Again, key effect of all these successful ops, the human component in mind. One thing I actually realized after working with the Israelis is that they can be extraordinarily patient. So a question everyone asks is, how did they do this? I talked to a former Israeli Unit 8200 member. He was a SIG-inter by trade, but actually worked a lot of human targets Mossad. And he said something really interesting. He said, first of all, the Israelis had a much higher tolerance for risk. Iran, for example, Hezbollah, existential threats. So they were able to do things, conduct these principal agent operations, something that I don't think U.S. intelligence would have been as capable of doing. They also had patience, resources, and resolve. So the story of October 7th is a tremendous intelligence failure, and then kind of on the rebound. But here we are in 2025, and so one of the key things I think to talk about is what are the challenges of human intelligence in the Middle East. I'm going to focus on the Middle East because often people thought of this as the third world, but it's not. What happens in countries such as Dubai, the Emirates, or Saudi Arabia, for example, running agents is exponentially harder because of the advent of many things. But let me go back to the tradecraft that we used for many years, from Sun Tzu to my time in government service. These are going out, you run surveillance detection routes, perhaps you do brush passes, a dead drop, you meet an agent, you run a reverse surveillance detection route, you come back, you receive your operational report. But in 2025, running agents is absolutely exponentially harder. So why? Why is that? And it's something that we're going to call the ubiquitous technical surveillance environment. I know, Shashank, you've written about this in The Economist. I think you might have quoted me as well in one of your pieces. But when you come to an airport, what do you see now? See biometrics. Takes your photo. There are places I go now, particularly in the Emirates. I get a little nervous when I walk in there because if I go to the airport, I perhaps have been there in a different name in the past. Biometrics is absolutely key. What about smart cities? Camera systems anywhere. London is a smart city. Beijing, the classic smart city. Washington, D.C. And remember in 2010, in Dubai, there was a Mossad hit on a Hamas member. There's a photograph of the Israeli team, or videos of it. One woman with a tennis racket, who I think I know that officer. But ultimately, back in 2010, this was certainly something that came on our radar. And then what about smartphones and smart cars? These are GPS systems that certainly can pinpoint your location. So it's the idea of digital dust. And so for a case officer who's used to kind of the old ways, everything seems to have changed now. And again, the Middle East advancement in all these technologies is evident if you walk the streets of Dubai or Riyadh. And so think of it in a couple different ways. What does the UTS environment mean? It's an explosion of data. It's the collection of data, the retention of data, and then artificial intelligence has the potential to manipulate that data, to harness it, and that affects our ability to run human intelligence operations. That's kind of the four key things. And as a former case officer, you certainly kind of have that oh crap moment. We certainly have to adjust. And a good definition of UTS, and let me just say what I'm saying right now has been open in the media and the public. Bill Burns, the former CIA director, has talked about CIA opened a center for ubiquitous technical surveillance. I imagine other services do as well. Glenn Chavitz, retired CIA officer, the first chief of our UTS center, states it's ubiquitous technical surveillance is the application of sensors, data, and algorithms which have been developed over the last 30 years. It tracks everything that all of us do. Pretty scary for a lot of reasons, for privacy reasons, but for the espionage world. Another good definition, that thousands of sensors track our activities everywhere all the time. The collection and storage of this data is what UTS is all about. It allows us and our competitors and our adversaries to forensically reconstruct events no matter how long ago they occurred, and to connect individuals with other people's activities and organizations. So it's that total dominance over our lives. I'll conclude just rather quickly with a couple things. How do we adjust? We adjust in ways such as rethinking how we run clandestine operations. For example, the use, what the Russians call illegals, what we call non-official cover officers. That's a businessman, a business person, businesswoman can go out and perhaps not run espionage operations from a government entity. Really important. And the last piece is perhaps looking at the technologies that our adversaries use. If it's a smart city, there's a camera operator. We can perhaps recruit them. Last piece on this, and I will jump off the stage in a moment, In the age of UTS, when human intelligence operations are harder, what is critical? Critical is our liaison partnerships. You know, there's the secret sauce of the CIA, British intelligence, Finnish, Swedish intelligence is you run unilateral assets and you have liaison operations. And so the exchange of information in this age of UTS, I believe, is going to be even more critical. In the Middle East, even more so. I'll tell one final story. A friend of mine, a journalist, came back from Amman. He had met with the Jordanians, the Jordanian General Intelligence Directorate. This was at a time when the Gaza war was hot. We all have talked about how the Israelis had cooperative relationship with the Arab states, and my friend, the journalist, asked the GID officer, you know, what are you doing with the Israelis? Is this important? And he said, we only have to do one thing. Remember, the Jordanian foreign minister is denouncing the Israelis publicly. So what did the GID officer say? He said, we have to do more. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marc.